This is Closereads,
a philosophy podcast with Mark and Wes.
I'm Wes Alwan.
And I'm Mark Linsenmeyer. Today we're discussing I was going to say contemporary, but I guess we're old and it's not contemporary anymore. But a paper by a living philosopher, Peter Railton. He was my undergrad advisor at University of Michigan. So I read this paper at the time called Moral Realism. It's from 1986. You ran across this right? You found some like most cited papers or something. Is that why?
Yeah, I found most cited papers, which most of them were analytic. So, and I don't know how that will play on a close reading, but we'll see.
Right. If I remember correctly, there's nothing particularly mathematical or, that sort of analytic about this, but it does have the Quinean attempt to work within a naturalistic framework, right? Something that is compatible with natural science in the broad sense. So that was one of the things that when I was trying to figure out my undergrad thesis, I was working with, and I thought at the time actually that just that it had to do with the is-ought distinction, that just being able to put the oughts in terms of is meant you satisfied the requirement. And my solution in my thesis was not terribly unlike the considerations we read about with Harry Frankfurt, that it had to do with identity, that your values are determined, or at least the psychological structure or the ontological structure of values are determined by what you identify as. So if you say, I'm a child of God, then that would have certain moral implications. So it really comes down to a neo-Aristotelian take, though I didn't have this vocabulary to express it at the time. But one of my reviewers, perhaps Peter Railton, said, hey, isn't this just Aristotle? Where the kind of thing you are determines, your teleology. It determines what the oughts that are sort of built into you are. That is not actually a very naturalistic program, talking about teleology. From what I recall, Peter Railton, it was much more straightforward, that it tried to define the good in terms of the good for you as to what you would agree to if you had all the relevant knowledge. So that's what I recall. We'll see if I'm right.
Yeah, I mean, I think one might conceive of it as naturalistic, as an Aristotelian. If you're thinking about health and sickness, right? We can establish health and sickness as norms, at least physically. So why can't we do that but we can do it with psychology as well, and that seems to provide a standard. It doesn't solve the is-ought distinction as Sam Harris thinks it does. So it doesn't give us the same kind of moral force to an imperative because it's hypothetical. You ought to do this because you'll be happier that way. And that includes other directed virtues. Like you ought not to kill because in general, we are constituted in such a way as creatures that deforms the soul, or however you want to put it. It's not psychologically healthy. It doesn't say much about the other exactly and why it's inherently wrong to hurt them, right? It becomes all about you and your happiness. But so I would argue that one might think of that as naturalistic, and then if you go to the Nietzschean position, and it's more about the individual telos, the same thing. It's just more individually tailored. It's bespoke Aristotelianism.
Right. And just the way that I summarized what I think we're going to be reading about in Railton, I'm not 100% sure why that would be naturalistic either. If it's just, what would I choose if I had the relevant information? Well, that's sort of that's very much a hypothetical imperative. So does it satisfy the needs of morality as Kant or someone would see it? It doesn't seem like it. And these sort of what would I do, these sort of hypotheticals, like how do those actually fit into a naturalistic picture of mere facts as opposed to modalities, possibilities, and much less, individual human intentions. Like it seems there is something to be, it is not, it's not the stuff that natural science talks about all day, which I thought was the point of naturalism, is to be able to, in a sort of Humean sense, say, well, we have certain sentiments and desires, and we ultimately have to build morality out of that. Seems like any naturalistic morality has to have something of that flavor, so we can see whether the introduction of intentions in hypothetical situations, much less if I had all of relevant, if I was like the person that I desired to be, what kind of weird abstraction is that? How does that fit into a naturalist framework? But maybe I'm mischaracterizing it entirely. Let's get to it.
All right. Among contemporary philosophers, even those who have not found skepticism about empirical science at all compelling, have tended to find skepticism about morality irresistible. For various reasons, among them an understandable suspicion of moral absolutism, it has been thought a mark of good sense to explain away any appearance of objectivity in moral discourse. So common has it become in secular intellectual culture to treat morality as subjective or conventional, that most of us now have difficulty imagining what it might be like for there to be facts to which moral judgments answer. All right, so that's a rather vague standard, facts to which moral judgments answer. That's compatible with a lot of different systems or metaethical theories, but it, what was I going to say? Yeah, it's not relativism, which he seems to think is predominant.
Right. It seems like it's going to promise to bridge the is-ought gap. There must be facts, is to which moral judgments answer. I mean, unless these are moral facts.
Well, I was suggesting that saying they'll answer is vague enough that it may not. Because for an Aristotelian, there are facts about human psyche to which moral judgments answer, but it doesn't solve the is-ought divide, doesn't cross it.
Undaunted, some philosophers have attempted to establish the objectivity of morality by arguing that reason or science affords a foundation for ethics. The history of such attempts hardly inspires confidence. Although rationalism in ethics has retained adherents long after other rationalisms have been abandoned, the powerful philosophical currents that have worn away at the idea that unaided reason might afford a standpoint from which to derive substantive conclusions show no sign of slackening. And ethical naturalism has yet to find a plausible synthesis of the empirical and the normative. The more it has given itself over to descriptive accounts of the origin of norms, the less has it retained recognizably moral force. The more it has undertaken to provide a recognizable basis for moral criticism or reconstruction, the less it has retained a firm connection with descriptive social or psychological theory. And there's a footnote that says 19th century evolutionary naturalism affords an example of the former, Dewey, and at least on one reading, perhaps Mill as well, an example of the latter.
All right, so let's talk about the former and the latter. So we have descriptive accounts of the origins of norms.
Right.
Sounds a bit like
I haven't read any Dewey about the
Hume or-
descriptive accounts of the origins of norms. I'm interested now.
Well, Dewey is an account of the latter, and Miller accounts are examples of the latter. So 19th century evolutionary naturalism, the former.
Okay,
so that,
sorry. Yep.
But that's not Hume, although it seems like Hume. Who is he thinking of for,
Spencer? I mean, post-Humeans who are, infatuated by Darwinism and want to say, just talk about,
evolutionary naturalism. Okay.
Churchland,
Yeah.
Right. If you just talk about, yes, we are, through evolution, we have a fellow feeling. We have, so there's plenty of folks, even in the modern day, that try to do this just to give the neurological or evolutionary or whatever basis for what looks like moral feeling, compassions, or even Kohlberg, the objectivity of moral judgments, that this is something that we very naturally develop, that doesn't actually say, well, why? Okay, we have these feelings, but what do they correspond to in the world that would make them right or wrong, as opposed to just culturally relative or even biologically relative. I don't know if they're common to all human beings. Like, it seems like that is what we're looking for, right? For if you want a scientific morality, it doesn't matter if something is sort of a moral fact in itself, and all rational beings would be required to follow, but just that this is a norm that is there in our the normal development. If that's not a circular way of putting it.
Well, yeah. So Spencer wrote a book called Social Statistics in 1851. That's before The Origin of Species in 1859. But I think Spencer, right, took this idea of survival of the fittest and Darwin's struggle for existence, which, by the way, is a phrase that appears over and over again in Mein Kampf. And so, right, he was criticized for using Darwin and Darwinism to justify, capitalism or industrialism or eugenics or any of these other values. But anyway, one could see, though, how evolution gives us our teleology. Once we've accepted modern science, it's no longer Aristotelian teleology, but it's whatever ends have been defined by the evolutionary process. And then the second one,
could I just, since we name dropped, so Herbert Spencer, known for social Darwinism, that is like the best people will rise to the top of the social. So this is like what Republicans today are often accused of being social Darwinists. Like, oh, if people are poor, that's because they're lazy, and they're but from what when this is, Herbert Spencer's been on our list before, we just haven't gotten around to him. And in fact, I had a sort of libertarian-ish guest who was a big advocate of Spencer, who said, first of all, that's a terrible way of summing up what Spencer actually said. Maybe this is the social effect of his theories. And secondly, that he was actually, as you said, before Darwin, that Darwin was taking his theory and applying it to biology and not the other way around. So I'm happy to leave that a mystery until we actually read some of it. But.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, I'd like to read that. Okay, the second, he's attributing to Dewey and Mill, and this is the idea, right, that it sounds like these are the people who are trying to maintain the force of an ought.
Yep.
As opposed to just giving descriptive accounts of norms, in which case they get away from social and psychological theory. So away from sentimentalism and Hume and his followers, and away from this evolutionary stuff. Okay.
I've still never read any Dewey on ethics at all that I can recall. I mean, his educational stuff obviously incorporates a lot of that in his, we read sort of this epistemology thing, and I know about his stuff on art, but I don't know about his, and the public and his problems. He has a lot of political stuff that has been on our list, but like a straight up ethical treatise, I didn't know he had such a thing. So,
all right. So we'll have to do that as well.
Yeah.
In what follows, I will present in a programmatic way a form of ethical naturalism which owes much to earlier theorists, but that seeks to effect a more satisfactory linkage of the normative to the empirical. All right, I'm getting excited now. Is he going to solve it? The link cannot, I believe, be affected by proof. It is no more my aim to refute moral skepticism than it is the aim of contemporary epistemic naturalists to refute Cartesian skepticism. The naturalist in either case has more modest aspirations. First, he seeks to provide an analysis of epistemology or ethics that permits us to see how the central evaluative functions of this domain could be carried out within existing or prospective empirical theories. Okay. Second, he attempts to show how traditional non-naturalist accounts rely upon assumptions that are in some way incoherent or that fit ill with existing science. And third, he presents to the skeptic a certain challenge, namely to show how a skeptical account of our epistemic or moral practices could be as plausible, useful, or interesting as the account the naturalist offers, and how a skeptical reconstruction of such practices, should the skeptic, as often as he does, attempt one, could succeed in preserving their distinctive place and function in human affairs. I will primarily be occupied with the first of these three aspirations. All right, so the first aspiration...
Provide an analysis of epistemology or ethics that permits us to see how the central evaluative functions of this domain could be carried out within existing or prospective empirical theories. So I don't know what the he's talking about with the central evaluative functions here, but I'm sure he's going to tell us.
Right. I'm not sure why epistemology has come in here, except maybe he's thinking of epistemic norms now on analogy to ethical norms. Maybe there's going to be some trick there involving that, right? We need epistemic norms. And
could it be, I mean, it just was making me think of the Metaethics book that we just read by Brian Ellis, that he is I mean, is he really arguing against skepticism? It seems like Ellis is giving a theory that, you know, you sort of have to get past skepticism and say, what is the most reasonable way to make sense of the structure of what it is that we do in fact know, via natural science? Not like we need to ground natural science. Maybe we don't know anything. It seems like he's just not taking Cartesian skepticism seriously, and maybe one can't if you're really going to do any good work.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but he certainly seems to be arguing against relativism, both Ellis and Aristotle, and that seems to, in a way, be the point of a natural kind or essentialist explanation. So, all right. So in the first case, the evaluative functions. So it sounds like ought statements, how they can be carried out within existing empirical theory. So again, it's quite vague. And then second, how traditional non-naturalist accounts rely upon assumptions that are in some way incoherent. Okay, so maybe we can't explain morality. Well, we need naturalism to explain morality.
So I don't know that we've actually read. We read G.E. Moore's Moral Intuitionism, which there is just an irreducible quality of the rightness of an action, the goodness of a result, whatever, that is non-natural just because that's not among the furniture of the world that natural science would discuss. It is not color. It's not shapes and magnitudes and things like that. So I think that counts as a non-naturalist, or, a early non-naturalist account.
Right. And then third, it's about whether the account is useful, plausible, or useful. Okay, those are two very different things. Or interesting. All right.
As compared to the skeptic.
Yeah, right.
Because you just go home if you're the skeptic. Like, nothing more is to be said. There is no ethics, but clearly we want to use. So this is like Hume saying, well, I'm a skeptic about causality, yet we use it all the time. So I'm going to have to construct this account of how the human psyche interprets everything causality, despite the fact that there's actually no justification for it at all in the world, in our, as far as our epistemic norms go. And that just seems like, really, if you're going to say so much about it, why don't we just admit it as legitimate somehow, like as, the move to Kant, just get different epistemic standards that allow this reasoning that we clearly engage in to be plausible, so that we can say this is a good causal account, this is a crappy causal account. If you say they're all equally crappy, it's just that our mind insists on them it's less satisfying.
Yeah, and I think also saying, as Hume says, that it's a habit of mind.
Mm-hmm.
But what is a habit? If that presumes some sort of causal account, then so skepticism is self-limiting, right? If it undoes its own the foundations or the sorts of assumptions that motivate it, it seems unworkable, which is part of the Hegelian critique, I think, of Kantians. But so yeah, one can't undo one's foundations, and Descartes, right, is not a skeptic. He's arguing against the skeptic. He uses skepticism as reductio ad absurdum. So it annoys me when people talk about Cartesian skepticism, this phrase Cartesian skepticism. But anyway, all right, let's see what he.
All right, so the final paragraph of the preface here. One thing should be said at the outset. Some may be drawn to or repelled by moral realism out of a sense that it is a view of ethics that best expresses high moral earnestness. Yet one can be serious about morality even to a fault without being a moral realist. Indeed, a possible objection to the sort of moral realism I will defend here is that it may not make morality serious enough.
The other thing I wanted to say about Hume is that I had listened to some lectures about Reid's critique of Hume, which you reminded me of, because we use causality all the time, right? We act as if it's true. And as Reid will point out, and as Ellis pointed out, our basis for thinking about causality, and this comes up in Tomasello as well, has to do with our own agency in the world and seeing our own causal behavior work. So I just wanted to add that. And
yeah, Thomas Reid has been suggested to us a few times and seems like a really important link historically between Hume and Kant, right? Even though Kant is specifically talking about Hume, it seems like we don't need a link.
And Reid is, Kant is accepting Hume in a way that Reid completely rejects. Reid is all about common sense. The phrase common sense is his calling card. But he also has a lot of fascinating stuff. So phenomenology, does a detailed phenomenology of how we might construct three-dimensional objects out of so he takes a very scientific approach, right? And then he has ideas about the theory-ladenness of perception, and not just that, the inherently symbolic quality of it. So when we perceive something in a way, we have to be perceiving a signifier and not just having sensations. It already rises to the level of the symbolic because, as we've discussed before, right, we can turn the object around and look at it from different perspectives, and we only have one particular perspective. And so the one particular perspective we have is actually a symbol. So his theory of natural signs is also something that interests me. It reminds me of Schlegel a little bit. It's on a bit of a different track because it's cognitive more than it is aesthetic. But all right. So section 1, species of moral realism. Or did you want to say anything about this last paragraph? High moral earnestness. I don't quite know what he means by that. The vagueness in the beginning makes me a little less excited. As it typically does with analytic philosophers. I think feel like I'm being promised something that he's not going to deliver on. But
well, if he defines
anyway.
maybe he's assuming that we are more steeped in the literature that we are of what actually constitutes a moral realist and who. So, for instance, is Hume not a moral realist, even though he definitely has an ethics and explains, the origins of our ethical theories, but yet it's still. He doesn't believe in categorical imperatives, seemingly, right there. But I'm not even sure completely about that. Maybe there's something more to be said. I don't know. It's clearly not merely made up. If you are a social constructionist, are you not a moral realist? Because moral realism means there is a metaphysically basic type of morality. I'm just not clear what the term means. So
I don't think social constructionists know, but they have the reputation of being relativist, or they're accused of that. So
I mean, but
And
if we
I don't
create
think,
it, then it's real, right? It's constructed. There it is. Money is real.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's a different kind of construct than a construct of a role in society. But yes, if gender is socially constructed, then there's still a gender psychology to us, right? It becomes real. It becomes
Right.
instantiated in our psychology, and it could have moral implications. It might be bad for us, for instance. It might be bad to the gender is something we need to get rid of. But all right. So section 1, species of moral realism. Such diverse views have claimed to be or have been accused of being realist about morality, that an initial characterization of the position I will defend is needed before proceeding further. Claims and accusations of moral realism typically extend along some or all of the following dimensions. Roughly put, 1, cognitivism are moral judgments capable of truth and falsity. 2, theories of truth. If moral judgments do have truth values, in what sense? 3, objectivity. In what ways, if any, does the existence of moral properties depend upon the actual or possible states of mind of intelligent beings? 4, I thought he was going to say states of affairs in the world, but okay. 4, reductionism. Are moral properties reducible to, or do they, in some weaker sense, supervene on non-moral properties? Naturalism. Are moral properties natural properties? Empiricism. Do we come to know moral facts in the same way that we come to know the facts of empirical science? Or are they revealed by reason or by some special mode of apprehension?
Maybe we should stop here just because there are 13 of these things that he's
Yeah,
just
and he better not be referring to them by their numbers in the future arguments, or I'm going to shoot myself on air.
Even the first one, I really, because I'm remembering, we read in that same moral intuitionism, we read Stevenson, I believe was the fellow's name, who was a non-cognitivist about moral judgments, that when you say this is good, you're really just saying, yay, it. So that is not, there's no truth value to that statement. It is not true, yay, it. I mean, if I can say boo it, but what is how do those disagree? It's not a matter of truth and falsity.
Was that a Yoda impersonation?
No.
True morality is not.
If moral judgments do have truth values, in what sense? I'm not totally sure if you think that truth is not, is constructed or pragmatic or not objective in some way, then yeah, whether or not it has a truth value might not actually decide the matter if you're a deflationist about truth or something.
True. Yeah, but one obviously can have
true pride.
Obviously can be a realist about, you could have a correspondence theory of truth and say my descriptive judgments correspond to facts in the world or whatever, but there are no moral facts. So if we say thou shalt not kill, if I say that's wrong to kill an innocent person, that statement, which most people would think is true, would have no truth value. It's neither true nor not true. Well, yeah.
Oh, yes, I shalt. And I kill you. Says
well,
you.
Maybe that's, to each their own. You shalt, I shalt not.
And the following properties here have to do with the relationship between value and facts. Does the existence of moral properties, do these depend on the possible states of mind of intelligent beings? Or I think you could say states of affairs of the world, as you just inserted as you were reading it.
Why is he talking about states of mind?
Well, if you want to say that this is what I was getting at, that maybe you could be a Humean and being a moral realist. If you say that moral sentiments are psychological facts, and that they're ones that we could, I want to say that, if we're operating normally, then we will all agree on them. So they're in that sense objective, right? This might be like color, that we think color is something in the mind, but it's a fact that this is red.
So constructivist, essentially, Kantian constructivist, but not just about objects as appearances, but about moral norms. But I thought he was putting this in this way as a counter to relativism, right? So, or in other words, the question is, do odd statements, does their truth depend entirely on states of affairs in the world, or does it not depend on that, but instead on our own mental states, or some combination of the two? So it need not be completely relativistic, but it could be relativistic. So in other words, there is no objective morality if it just depends on the minds of intelligent beings, or we have to do some kind of fancy constructivist thing, which you just described. But that might, and for Kant, that is just what objectivity is. But we might not be satisfied with that kind of account. It's not the kind of objectivity we want, because we want things in the world, right? We want a correspondence to, things in themselves.
Right. The introduction before he starts giving this numbered list is claims and accusations of moral realism typically extend along some or all of the following dimensions. So he's not saying moral realism is characterized in these ways. If there is there are definite truth values, like he's putting them in terms of questions. So this is what is introducing some of the difficulty here. Is it is relevant whether alleged moral facts correspond to human actual or possible states of mind. But how is it relevant? Is it that, as you're saying, if they correspond to states of mind, then they're merely subjective? Or as I was saying, if they correspond to states of mind, that actually was what provides their objectivity? I don't know yet.
Yeah. It's a very slippery way, again, to put all this stuff. He's not going to say moral realism says 1, 2, 3, 4, blah, blah, blah. He's saying, oh, here's some relevant considerations. And we don't know yet, apparently.
Well, for most of them, it seems like if the answer to the question is yes, then it's moral realist. Reductionism. Are moral properties reducible, or do they in some weaker sense supervene upon non-moral properties? If so, right, so whatever will bring the most pleasure to the most people, that is very much a moral realist theory. Like, it is really the truth that it is wrong to do something that violates the utility principle, according to this theory.
Mm-hmm. And then naturalism, are they natural properties? Because conceivably, one could be a moral realist, like, what's the guy that you referenced earlier? Moore, yeah, but not think that these are empirical natural properties of the empirical world, like, ascribing properties to spatiotemporal objects. You could say, well, there's a metaphysical domain, and those have real properties. I'm a realist in that Platonic sense, but not a naturalist.
I think I came out of this whole debate not a naturalist, thinking like, oh, I thought I was supposed to be a naturalist because, of course, everybody's a naturalist. Don't you respect natural science? But no, actually, the way philosophers talk about naturalism, there can be plenty of things that are facts, that are objective facts, but we don't consider them in the natural realm because they're not the things that are talked about by natural science. And in fact, to think otherwise is scientism.
Mm-hmm. Empiricism, do we come to know them the same way as the facts of empirical science? Okay. Revealed by reason, right? So we could say, well, we have intellectual intuition of Platonic forms. Mm-hmm. All right, shall I read on?
Yes, go on. Number 7.
Number 7, bivalence. Bivalence. Does the principle of the excluded middle apply to moral judgments? So it's either true or not true.
Yeah.
But not neither true nor not true. Number 8, determinateness. Given whatever procedures we have for assessing moral judgments, how much of morality is likely to be determinable? Categoricity. Do all rational agents necessarily have some reason to obey moral imperatives? Universality. Are moral imperatives applicable to all rational agents, even should they exist those who lack a reason to comply with them? 11, assessment of existing moralities. Are present moral beliefs approximately true, or do prevailing moral intuitions in some other sense constitute privileged data? 12. Relativism. Does the truth or warrant of moral judgments depend directly upon individually or socially adopted norms or practices? Pluralism. Is there a uniquely good form of life or a uniquely right moral code? Or could different forms of life or moral codes be appropriate in different circumstances?
So my little hypothesis that he's asking questions, and if the answer is yes, then it's morally real, is defied by a lot of these. That the one right after that was an either or. Do we get it through the same way we know other facts of empirical science, or are they revealed by reason? Which clearly either of those actually could make you moral realist. It's relevant, but a Kantian or, on my account, maybe a Humean could both be morally realist. Categoricity, man, in other words, the categorical versus the hypothetical imperative, but making it into that noun categoricity, categoricality. Well, I guess better than that.
Imperativity. Okay, there's a lot here, and I don't know that we need to go through every single one of them again. They're relatively clear, I think.
Yeah, mostly have to do with cultural relativism, that if we could say that whatever the culture determines is right, is in fact right. Well, that's one way of actually being a moral realist, is you're saying it is a moral fact because the culture has, the culture determinately defines something. That's another issue that he raises, is how can we even know, by many of these potential criteria? And if you say, well, it's what you really, really want, that's what the right thing is for you. Well, is there actually something that I really, really want for everybody?
Yeah, but I think right. So he's saying if moral judgments depend directly on individually or socially adopted norms or practices, then that would be relativism, which would not be moral realism. I don't think you could square those two. But
I'm
maybe.
not sure about that. We'll have to see, because universality is relevant. Universality would be the opposite of moral relativism, but is it the case that, he just hasn't told us?
Well, traditionally, right, with Kant, you don't get morality without universality, because that's part of what an ought is, right? Everyone must do this. It's not just I ought to do this, because then there's no imperative in general, but we'll see.
Here then are the approximate coordinates of my own view in this multidimensional conceptual space. I will argue for a form of moral realism which holds that moral judgments can bear truth values in a fundamentally non-epistemic sense of truth. Okay. That moral properties are objective, though relational. That moral properties supervene upon natural properties and may be reducible to them. That moral inquiry is of a piece with empirical inquiry. That it cannot be known a priori whether bivalence holds for moral judgments, or how determinately some judgments can be assessed. That there is no reason to think that we know. That there is reason to think that we know a fair amount about morality, but also reason to think that current moralities are wrong in certain ways and could be wrong in quite general ways. That a rational agent may fail to have a reason for obeying moral imperatives, although they may nonetheless be applicable to him. And that, while there are perfectly general criteria of moral assessment, nonetheless, by the nature of these criteria, no one kind of life is likely to be appropriate for all individuals, and no one set of norms appropriate for all societies in all times. The position thus described might well be called stark raving moral realism, but for the sake of syntax, I will colorlessly call it moral realism. This usage is not proprietary. Other positions occupying more or less different coordinates may have equal claim to either name.
Right. So the idea that morality might be relative to individuals and to societies is not necessarily relativism. It doesn't mean that we can choose anything. It doesn't imply that. There might be some general framework that we have to stay in.
I had some terminology at some, maybe folks who remember past episodes better than me, that I really liked, of differentiating different kinds of relativism, that it was like speaker based relativism versus agent based relativism. So agent based relativism could just mean like, I think I'm doing this right, that I'm remembering this correctly. Agent based relativism would just be different people have different duties, right? You're an agent, and so what is good for you to do, what is right for you to do, might be different from what I as agent have, because we're just different kinds of people. We are in different locations in society. But a speaker based relativism would be like, oh, I can't judge you from another society. In other words, what is going to be good according to me as theorist is going to be different than what is good in, let's say we're both contemplating the ancient Romans, and you're in 19th century German and you're talking about the ancient Romans. You could correctly say those ancient Romans were wrong. And that I, in the present day, could correctly say those ancient Romans were just right, because actually what they were doing corresponds. And, and the ancient Romans were definitely right about their own, right? That would be the kind of relativism, speaker-based relativism, that people actually object to. Agent-based relativism is not really relativism at all. It just says different people have different, there's not that universality because people are in different situations, or it's a different kind of universality. Do you have a better way of describing that?
Well, maybe that there's a different teleology for different kinds of. Right. So we take, if we're an Aristotelian, we take morality to be built off the teleology of human beings in general. But there might be a teleology to Romans per se that differs from Germans.
Especially if you get into specifics, because it could be that there are universal moral norms like be polite to everybody, but what constitutes politeness obviously varies a lot between societies. So.
Mm-hmm. All right. Section 2, the fact value distinction. Finally, no. Any attempt to argue for a naturalistic moral realism runs headlong into the fact value distinction. Philosophers have given various accounts of this distinction and of the arguments for it, but for present purposes, I will focus upon several issues concerning the epistemic and ontological status of judgments of value, as opposed to judgments of fact.
Okay.
Clear enough.
Perhaps the most frequently heard arguments for the fact-value distinction is epistemic. It is claimed that disputes over questions of value can persist even after all rational or scientific means of adjudication have been deployed. Hence, value judgments cannot be cognitive in the sense that factual or logical judgments are. This claim is defended in part by appeal to the instrumental, hypothetical, character of reason, which prevents reason from dictating ultimate values. In principle, the argument runs, two individuals who differ in ultimate values could, without manifesting any rational defect, hold fast to their conflicting values in the face of any amount of argumentation or evidence. As Ayer puts it, so A.J. Ayer, we find that argument is possible on moral questions only if some system of value is presupposed.
Right. So this is a very fancy way of putting the fact value distinction, but it suggests that we are stuck with hypothetical judgments. So we can't say that, one ought to do X except relative to some goal that we have. I ought to do X if I want to be happy, or I ought to do X if I want a relationship. So that we have those sorts of hypothetical judgments, but we need a goal to begin with. If we don't have a goal, we can't simply fish one out of. And, so it's we can't do a special Kantian thing to pull categoricity, so to speak, out of the air.
I don't know that fundamental moral system of values has to be put in terms of goals. That just saying you can't argue for a value except based on another value. So there have to be some values that we all just share. I'm not sure that's the same as saying there's some goals we all just share. Maybe like if you want to say health is just an inherent value, which I think is what Nietzsche is saying, then that would be, well, everybody on some level wants health or has health as a goal, or if operating normally should have health as a goal, which is a weird sort of self-contradicting. You might not actually have the goal, but you should have the goal. But I was defining shoulds in terms of goals. I don't know. Is there a problem with that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I was equating them with goals, but maybe you're right. Maybe it turns out that there's not always a goal associated with the value. But here he's outlining someone who says there is a fact value distinction. This is the Humean point of view cast in modern terms, which is to say we could know every descriptive statement about the world that there is to know. And yet that wouldn't settle disputes over value. Any normative statements would still be subject to dispute despite that. So we can't squeeze the normative out of the descriptive, even if we had every possible descriptive statement that there is to make.
Right. So I think looking at this through an example of utilitarianism or something would be the just like, how can you say that this is the right action? This hurts everybody. It's like, well, why do you think hurting is bad?
Right.
Well, how are you going to argue with somebody like that? They're just, They don't share some fundamental thing that we should have, which is part of that would be a goal. Like you don't want to be hurt, do you? Well, maybe I do. So, but also just like, even if we all share the goal that we don't personally want to be hurt, why is the hurting of others? Why is the other of value to any of us? Is that
right? And I've been thinking about this lately with respect to the philosophy of self-defense, which I'm hoping we'll do an episode on soon too. But the idea is that there is kind of an egoism which is foundational to altruistic morality. In other words, altruism speaking broadly, there would be no reason to respect you as a subject in the Kantian sense, or to be morally comported to you if you didn't, or in other words, get a more specific example. There'd be no reason for me not to kill you if you didn't care about your life at all, if it meant nothing to you. If you were completely indifferent to it, it would be like the same thing as having a cup of tea with you. As long as you weren't, as long as that didn't hurt you. So in other words, you have to value your life.
Sure.
In a way, your life has to be more important to you than anyone else's life for me to say, I ought not to kill you. That there has to be something very special about your relationship to your own life. Anyway, there needs to be a better way to articulate that. And I don't know if anyone else has said that. I'm sure there is a philosopher who said it, but if there is, I don't know who.
Yeah, I don't know that I agree with it, but I don't want to completely sidetrack us. But let's
not
think that's a good thing
sidetrack
to
us.
keep in mind. Are you next or am I next? Yeah, you're next.
One might attempt to block this conclusion by challenging the instrumental conception of reality, of rationality. But for all its faults, and for all that it needs to be developed, the instrumental conception seems to me the clearest notion we have of what it is for an agent to have reasons to act. Moreover, it captures a central normative feature of reason-giving, since we can readily see the commending force for an agent of the claim that a given act would advance his ends, as in goals, right? So maybe I'm right. It would be hard to make such sense of someone who sincerely claimed to have certain ends, and yet at the same time insisted that they could not provide him even prima facie grounds for action. Of course, he might also believe that he has other, perhaps countervailing grounds.
So the instrumental conception of rationality, I think, is the hypothetical imperative, is that what rationality is it connects goals and means, right? Goals and particular actions that you're taking.
Well, ends and goals and means, ends and means.
Yep.
And so I want this, or this is my goal, and therefore I must do X, Y, and Z to get it. It's a planning thing. And that's what rationality is,
As opposed to Kantian rationality that's supposed to just apply categorically, even if you don't have goals. There's something about that, I think, from a natural science perspective that doesn't make sense, that you would as a naturalist, you would want to reject there to be an autonomous realm of oughts.
Well, Kant, right, wants to reject, he's rejecting Platonism. It's not that we have an intellectual intuition of a moral norm, but he has a fancy way of getting us to moral norms anyway. And it's not naturalistic, but it's supposed to be compatible with the naturalistic, and it's supposed to be quote unquote critical, right? Mm-hmm. Critique of pure reason. It's a critical approach. And that approach says that if we're going to be rational, we can't be self-contradictory. And moral norms are just those norms that we must have. Otherwise, we would stand in self-contradiction. So anyway, we can't.
So
let's not get sidetracked
with that,
but
a denial of the instrumental conception of rationality. That Kant says the instrumental conception is not the only kind there is. There is this more fundamental kind.
Categorical.
Yes.
Categorical, non-hypothetical, where the laws of normative laws are issued. We issue them to ourselves as rational creatures, such that we would no longer be rational if we defy them. And yeah, and then one might object, well, isn't there an instrumentality to that? Aren't you just saying if you want to be rational, then blah, blah, blah? Or so that's why I didn't want to get us into those objections to Kant, but
right. It captures the instrumental conception of rationality captures a central normative feature of reason giving, whereas the Kant's does not, that there could be something that you recognize objectively, according to Kant, as this is the right thing to do, and yet have no motivation at all to do that. That requires a separate, it's a moral psychology to do. I mean, that's
so. It sounds like
Kantian. You're not going to think that's a particularly good argument against you, but I think that by just categorizing himself, I'm a moral naturalist, he's just ruling out all the kinds of Kantian logic.
Yeah, so he's going to, and right in the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, Kant begins by talking about this instrumental conception of rationality with respect to Aristotle, and he calls it eudaimonism. And he's going to tell us he's rejecting that. So the whole point of the categorical imperative is just to precisely to reject this sort of view. But Railton is going to bite the bullet on this and say, well, I do accept this point of view, and I'm going to try to get morality anyway, it sounds like.
Yep. Yet this version of the epistemic argument for the fact-value distinction is in difficulty even granting the instrumental conception of rationality. From the standpoint of instrumental reason, belief formation is but one activity among others. To the extent that we have reasons for engaging in it or for doing it one way rather than another, these are at bottom a matter of its contribution to our ends. What it would be rational for an individual to believe on the basis of a given experience will vary not only with respect to his other beliefs, but also with respect to what he desires. And there are some footnotes here. I don't know if we should be looking at these.
Yeah, let's do them in order so why don't you, these are at bottom a matter of his contribution to our ends, and then footnote 3, what does that say?
In saying this, I'm insisting that questions about what it would be rational to believe belong to practical rather than theoretical reason. While results of theoretical reason, for example, conclusions about deductive inferences, are in general relevant to questions about rational belief, they are not determinative apart from the agent's practical reason.
All right, so this is
reason. Yeah, go ahead.
This is the trick that I was anticipating earlier, which is that he's going to talk about epistemic norms, and he's saying we can't escape the normative. Right. This isn't just about morality. This is more broadly about what it is rational to believe.
Then the other footnote is just to read the sentence that it's referring to. What it would be rational for an individual to believe on the basis of a given experience will vary not only with respect to his other beliefs, but with respect to what he desires, which just reading that seems like something that we should object to. Like, I don't want to believe that this person has been unfaithful to me, so I won't believe it. Like, no, that's not not how you do science, certainly. The footnote says, of course, individual belief formation is not typically governed by explicit means and reasoning, but rather by habits of belief formation and tendencies to invest varying degrees of confidence in particular kinds of beliefs. If we accept an instrumental account of rationality, then we can call such habits rational from the standpoint of the individuals to the extent that they fit into a constellation of attitudes and tendencies that promote his ends.
Okay, so yeah, it's not necessarily desire on some specific occasion. Rather, right, there's a broad landscape to our ends and our desires. And that plays a role in our habits of belief formation. Habits is a word that makes him sound very Humean.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you have an example in mind. I was thinking about like to what degree am I going to admit in a given observation that maybe ghosts are responsible? That, you know, a certain kind of person might really be fascinated by ghosts and just want to see ghosts everywhere. But most people, it's just not useful. I want to actually find my keys. It doesn't help me to think maybe ghosts hid my keys. No, I just need to go through the you know, so it's pure pragmatism.
Yeah. There's got to be a way that we can say that someone is someone is wrong if they think the ghost has their keys. I mean, I think hopefully he would want to say that it's not just true relative to some conceptual scheme, but there, you know, so this is now we're talking about, we're not talking necessarily about what's true, but we're talking about epistemology. So what would it be rational to believe? Or but that seems to be, to me, a different question than what are the psychological mechanisms that go into belief formation. Hopefully he's avoiding psychologism. He's not just giving a psychological account of belief formation and saying that that's the same as what it means to have a rational belief if it operates well. So would it be rational for an individual to believe? What would it be rational for an individual to believe based on the basis of a given experience, or what it would be, will vary not only with respect to his other beliefs, but also with respect to what he desires. So yeah, for the psychology of belief formation, I mean, that's clearly true. If I'm trying to evaluate whether or not the ghost stole my keys, then what it would be rational to believe, even if I'm wrong, that there are that there are such things as ghosts, given a certain conceptual scheme and set of beliefs, right? There are such things as ghosts, and we as a society believe in them. We have certain rituals around it, and blah blah blah. And what I desire, right? It's important to me. It's part of a larger religious practice, and life isn't meaningful unless there are ghosts, and all that stuff, you know, is relevant to whether or not it's rational to believe in ghosts. And so I can rationally believe something. It could be rational for me to believe something that is in fact false. It's just a matter of what data I have and what's conceptual and what theoretical scheme I'm stuck in. So, okay. You want to read the rest of it?
Yeah, let me just finish. I think let's finish this paragraph, and then I see that he's going to go into a several-page thing about Hume, so this maybe is a good place to stop.
Okay.
From this, it follows that no amount of mere argumentation or experience could force one, on pain of irrationality, to accept even the factual claims of empirical science. The long-running debate over inductive logic well illustrates that rational choice among competing hypotheses requires much richer and more controversial criteria of theory choice than can be squeezed from instrumental reason alone. Unfortunately for the contrast Ayer wished to make, we find that argument is possible on scientific questions only if some system of value is presupposed.
Okay.
So you might have thought that if we could agree on all the facts and still not agree on the values, but actually he's saying we could agree on all the observations and still not, or there's something that we could have the same sensory experience and still not just even agree on the facts. And that is very comparable to why, the way that we might not agree on values, the way we might not agree on facts. So these are not two separate realms. There's a similar indeterminacy in our belief formation in both cases.
Well, it sounds like he's saying that data will underdetermine the scientific theory unless we have a system of values, which seems to me must be a system of epistemic norms.
Yes,
it can't just be, I want this or I want that, therefore I don't believe that quarks exist. It has to be a set of values about what it's rational to believe. So debate over inductive logic. Okay. Yeah. Is induction warranted in some way, or is it, this is the Humean question. Rational choice among competing hypotheses, right? Hypotheses about scientific theories. It's more richer. So, yeah. Do I accept induction? Do I reject it? Am I a Popperian about there's got to be falsifiability and this and that? It sounds like he thinks that this depends ultimately on a system of values. So anyway, if the facts underdetermine scientific theories, that's, as you were saying, comparable to all the facts underdetermining our normative statements.
Yep.
In fact, we have to presume something normative to develop these theories. It sounds a bit like Lakatos, right? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yep.
So there is no such thing as a pure observation. We come into it with certain instruments and with a certain theoretical framework that makes the observation possible. And maybe that theoretical framework includes values, at least epistemic norms.
All right. So we only got through.
It's fine.
How many pages?
This is great.
We're on page 6 now. Is there
out of 46? Maybe
Yes.
we can speed up as we go. But
well, I'm seeing that the thing that I was characterizing as his view is as early as like page 14. So I think we're going to get to it. If not next time, then certainly the time after. Hopefully next time. So maybe we don't have to do 7 episodes on this.
Yeah,
I
think maybe we can. I'm hoping we can speed up. But this is very, very useful to me. So far. Okay.
All right, great. Hope you folks are enjoying it. Let us know what you'd like us to read. Bye, everybody.
Bye.